of Genesis. We started all the way back with Genesis 1:1. We are now to Genesis chapter 6, which is the flood chapter. The reason why Genesis is so important is that it is quoted many times in the New Testament and alluded to. The passage that we're looking at today, and we're looking at the flood, this passage is alluded to throughout the New Testament in various ways. And we're going to start, even before we get into the chapter, and we'll be looking at the chapter verse by verse, but even before we get into it, we want to look at one of the major themes of this and why it is so important. When both Jesus and Peter were talking about Genesis chapter 6, they always referred to the fact that it was a teaching opportunity to show us about the second coming of Christ. The allusion is always to what coming. And so this is another reason, by the way, to believe in the historicity of Genesis, to believe that these things referred to actually occurred in time and space and history, because Jesus obviously believed it, Peter obviously believed it, and they referred to this as real historical events. Many in the church today do not believe that Noah was a historical figure, or if he was, that this was not a worldwide flood, etc. But Jesus called it that. Peter called it that. And so that's another reason why this is so crucially important. Several principles that we see at work here. One is the principle that this is judgment. And we looked at already, and we're going to go back and look again at what the world was like, the world that God stepped into history and judged that world. But the principle is that when he steps in to judge, he typically delivers the righteous out of that judgment. When he stepped in to judge Egypt, the first thing he did was to deliver the Israelites from Egypt. Later on in history, when he steps in to judge the world at the end of time in the day of the Lord, he will first take out the church. Well, here he's about to step in and judge increasingly evil world. And the first thing he did before he judged is he took out the righteous people, which were only Noah and his family. There's several similarities between the flood and the second coming. One of the things is that God told them that there would be judgment, but he didn't tell them when the time was going to be. It's according to the early verses of Genesis chapter 6, we think there's about maybe as much as 120 years between the time that God determines to judge and the time the judgment actually starts. And so no one knew, even Noah did not know. No one knew. Of course, the other people did not believe it was going to happen anyway. So there was an uncertain time there as to when it was going to happen. Certainly unbelievers were not looking for it. Unbelievers did not know what was going to happen. Noah only found out, remember that sometime in sort of in Bible mythology, the stories we like to tell, God comes to Noah and says, Noah, I'm going to judge the world with water, and I want you to build an ark. That's not the way it happened. I will look at this today in Genesis chapter 6. God told him to build an ark, and he told him he was going to judge the earth. It was only later that Noah started building the ark with no idea about what God was going to do. So even Noah did not know exactly what was going to happen. Next is that there is before this happens, there is a seeming normalcy about life, because no one realized, there was not something going on where people would say, oh, God's getting ready to judge the earth. If you have a Bible, look with me at Luke 17, because Jesus is talking about just this situation. Luke chapter 17. This is a very, very familiar passage. Again, it's one of those, passages in the New Testament which refers to Genesis 6. And once you get kind of sensitive to this, you'll begin to see that that Genesis 6 and the flood story is referred to throughout the New Testament. Okay, Luke chapter 17, verse 26. Jesus is speaking here. He said, "And just as it happened in the days of Noah, so it will also be in the days of the Son of Man. They were eating, they were drinking, they were marrying, they were being given in marriage until the day that Noah entered the ark and the flood came and destroyed them all." There was no indication at all as to what was going to happen. Life was normal. And in fact, the very normalcy of life led many people to say nothing's going to happen. Now look over at 2 Peter. One more passage about the coming of the Lord. 2 Peter chapter 3. Just go to Revelation and then go back a couple of books. 2 Peter chapter 3, verse 3. 2 Peter 3:3. Know this first of all, that in the last days mockers will come with their mocking, following after their own lusts and saying, "Where is the promise of his coming? For ever since the fathers fell asleep, all continues just as it was from the beginning of creation. For when they maintain this, it escapes their notice that by the word of God the heavens existed long ago, and the earth was formed out of the water and by water," that's referring to the creation, "through which the world at that time was destroyed, being flooded with water." Jesus said that in the last days, the prevailing attitude in the world would be one of what we call uniformitarianism, is that everything continues just as it was. Life continues. Nothing has changed. Why would I believe that God is going to do something? I've never seen God do anything like this. My parents have never seen God do anything like this. I don't see any evidence of that. Indeed, life goes on, marrying, giving in marriage, everything that we would normally expect to happen. And in the middle of that, God steps in. And that's one of the signs that indeed he is. He said, it's just like the flood. And Jesus and Peter were both saying, if you're going to understand the second coming, you've got to understand the flood. In both situations, things are getting worse. In fact, look over at 2 Timothy, just a couple of books. 2 Timothy 3. 2 Timothy 3, but realize this. We're in the verse 1. 2 Timothy 3:1, but realize this, that in the last days difficult times will come. For men will be lovers of self, lovers of money, boastful, arrogant, revilers, disobedient to parents, ungrateful, unholy, unloving, irreconcilable, malicious gossips, without self-control, brutal, haters of God, treacherous, reckless, conceited, lovers of pleasure rather than lovers of God, holding to a form of godliness, although have denied its power. They have denied its power. And so he's saying that the world will degenerate and God is getting ready to step in, but the world itself will not see evidence that God is getting ready to step in. In fact, the world will say, we've never seen anything like this. It didn't happen before. It's not going to happen now. And so, again, both Jesus and Peter are saying, if you're going to understand the second coming, you've got to understand the flood of Noah. Because everything that we see happening in the flood of Noah, we will see happening in the second coming. God is getting ready to judge the earth, a different kind of judgment. Indeed, after he judged with water, he said, I will not again judge the world with water. But he's going to judge it with fire. But before he judged the earth with water, he took Noah and his family out on the ark. before he judges the earth with fire in the tribulation, he will take out the church through the rapture of the church. When the Lord descends from heaven, the dead will rise first, and then we who are alive and living, and if you are alive at the time of the rapture, you're going about life, you're driving, you're cooking, you're talking to your kids, you're reading, you're watching TV, whatever, and all of a sudden you're gone. You disappear because God has instantly transformed you, and you never experience death. And you get your resurrection body, and you are there with him in heaven. That's the deliverance that will come, even as the deliverance that did come. Well, we are now ready to look at Genesis chapter 6. First of all, we had to look at the importance of this and how it is used in the New Testament. Now let's rejoin where we left off. And the last verse we looked at was Genesis chapter 6, verse 8. And we're just going to go through this verse by verse in chapter 6 and 7. Verse 9 of chapter 6. These are the records of the generations of Noah. Noah was a righteous man, blameless in his time. Noah walked with God. Noah became the father of 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Interestingly enough, now the world had millions, some say billions of people at this point. Why? Because lifespans were very long. The reproductive life was very long. Our reproductive lifespan, typically with women, runs into several decades. In those days, women were still having babies up in their hundreds. And so people living longer, having babies longer, and the population of the earth was really quite large at that point. And yet, when God looked for those that he was going to save out of the coming judgment, there was only Noah and his family. Verse 11, now the earth was corrupt in the sight of God, and the earth was filled with violence. God looked on the earth, and behold, it was corrupt. All flesh had corrupted their way upon the earth. And so God was going to mercifully destroy and go back and wipe the slate clean and give man another chance on the earth. Then God said to Noah, verse 13, the end of all flesh has come before me. Notice that beginning with verse 13 down to verse 21, all this is a quotation. It's probably in quotation marks in your Bible. This is something that God said. There's several times when God breaks through and explains things to Noah. And this is one of those times. The end of all flesh has come before me, for the earth is filled with violence because of them. Behold, I am about to destroy them with the earth. Notice, he's not saying I'm going to destroy people. God's going to destroy the earth. He essentially remade the earth, the climate of the earth, the face of the earth, everything on earth that we know. He wiped it out. The earth pre-flood and the earth post-flood was a very, very different place. And so he had given man dominion over the earth, and man had sinned, and earth was a part of that. And so God wiped the slate clean. And he said, I'm going to destroy them with the earth. Make for yourself an ark of gopher wood. You shall make the ark with rooms, and you shall cover it inside and out with pitch. First question is, what is gopher wood? We don't know. We don't have that today. That could be a tree which we no longer have. It could be something that we now call by a different name. Remember I said that the earth was going to be recreated, destroyed, and redone. There are several things that existed before the flood that did not exist after the flood. And so maybe this is one of those trees that could exist in the pre-flood world but could not exist in the post-flood world. And so, what is gopher wood? We're not sure. But whatever it was something that God knew would be perfect for the ark. Now, notice that God did not say build a boat. The ark served as a boat, but in many ways was not a boat. I mean, there was a word for boat that he could have used. The only time this word is used in the Old Testament, it's also, remember when Moses' family built a little an ark, really, and put him in the water so that he would be found by Pharaoh's daughter. That basket that they put in the river to float Moses down to be found later, that's called an ark too. Remember that when Moses built the ark, there's no bridge there where Captain Noah guided the ark. There was no wheel whereby he said, okay, 3 degrees to the right or anything like that. The ark was not a boat that was guided. There was no rudder on the ark. The ark was basically a floating box to save Noah and his family and the animals. So it was covered with pitch on the inside now for waterproofing. He went ahead to give the dimensions of it, and he said, this is how you shall make it. The length of the ark, 300 cubits, its breadth 50 cubits, and its height 30 cubits. So how long is that? Again, don't know exactly because there were several different cubit measures. There were some cubit measures that were in use during that time in like in Israel when Moses eventually wrote this. There was a thing called the Egyptian cubit. It's somewhere, basically the cubit was the length from your longest finger down to your elbow. So about 1.5 feet, but some cubits were a little longer than that, like the Egyptian cubit was about 20 inches. And Moses, remember, had been brought up in Egypt. He knew the language and measuring systems of the Egyptian. And so was he using the Egyptian cubit? We're not sure. But so bottom line is, how long is the ark? Somewhere between 450 feet and 500 feet. 450 if you take the smaller measure, 500 if you take the larger. The ark was the largest ocean-going, it was built around 2000 BC, and it was the largest ocean-going vessel built up until the 1800s. It was huge. 450 feet long, 45 feet high. It would hold something like 800 railroad boxcars of cargo, several different decks in the ark, 1.5 million cubic feet of cargo space in the ark. It was huge. It was enough for, and I'm sure Noah wondered at the time, why is this thing so big? Remember, God told him little by little. He said, the first revelation is, I'm going to judge the earth. The second one is, I'm going to save you and your family. The third revelation is, I want you to build an ark. The next revelation is, here's what it's going to look like. And it's basically a floating box. Why? Moses did not have to pilot it anywhere or take it anywhere. It was just to in the tremendous flood that happened, it was to be very stable, not to turn over, and just to float. And if there was any taking it anywhere, God would have had to guide it wherever. So at this point, that's all Noah knew, but he's about to find out something else. Verse 16, you shall make a window for the ark, and finish it to a cubit from the top, and the door of the ark on the side of it. And you shall make it with lower, second, and third decks. Remember, there's one door into the ark. Interestingly enough, a lot of commentators make pretty big deal of this. And it probably is. If the ark represents salvation, if the ark represents Christ, if the ark represents deliverance, how many ways could you get into the ark? There was one way into the ark. And Noah, the animals, the family, all had to go in one way. And when they got in, when God was ready to send judgment, he didn't say, Noah, close the door. He said, God closed the door. Every nail was pounded by Noah and his sons. Everything was built. Every animal stall was built. Every bit of pitch was done by human agency. God did not build any of the ark. He told them how to build it, told them what to build it out of, told them how big to do it, but God didn't do any of that. What God did do was when it was time for judgment to start, God closed the door. But we'll get to that. Verse 17, and behold, even I am bringing a flood of water upon the earth. And the word flood there, this is the first mention, by the way, of the flood. Before this, remember, Noah knew about the ark, but Noah didn't know why he was doing it. Now God tells him what he's about to do. And this is not the kind of flood that we would use now for, like the creek overflowed and it flooded my backyard and things like this. This is a word which has been translated like cataclysm. God is saying, I am going to bring a monstrous cataclysm of water upon the earth. He said, I will bring a flood of water upon the earth to destroy it, and all flesh in which is the breath of life from under heaven. Everything that is on the earth shall perish. Every living thing, not just people, but animals, really everything except fish. Birds, animals, etc., they perished. They perished in the water. Then there was so much movement, seismic activity during that time, and tsunamis and things that we'll talk about in a few minutes, that ultimately when there's that much flooding, you have tremendous movements of silt and soil, etc., and that ultimately would cover up the thing that we now call the fossil record. In other words, the idea that people say that the earliest days were the earliest kinds of life, and then as we go down through millions and millions of years, we find different layers with different kinds of life, which is an opinion, which is a theoretical perspective. But even those people, even those scientists, if they admitted, even evolutionary scientists, if they admitted the flood, which they will not admit, because that means that there is a God outside their closed system who can intervene in that system. And the idea behind science is that everything goes on. It's just things happen over a period of time, and there are slow changes over that period of time. That's the whole scientific idea. But if they were to admit that at one point there was a God who intervened in the world, and he actually flooded the world up to the highest mountaintops, if that happened, and if you had the kind of water movement and sand and silt and mud and dirt and rock that you would expect in a flood like that, and then that was drained away, then what would you expect to find? You would expect to find the simplest things buried at first. The things that were more mobile, that could move, would be buried later on. The highest, like dinosaurs and things like that, would be buried in a higher level than other things in the lower level. And so they would admit, yeah, that would explain it, but that can't be true because it requires a God to judge the earth. And so since we know that God is not true, that God, if there is a God, he never stepped into history, That's uniformitarianism. Everything goes on like it has always gone on. But, yes, if there was a God, and if that God judged the earth, and if he judged it with water, and if he judged it with so much water that even mountains were covered with water, if that happened, and if there were earthquakes and tsunamis and giant upheavals in the earth, if that were to happen and then drain off, what would you expect to happen? Yeah, you'd expect a layer of dead things even as we find them today. Remember that if you've got a cow in a field and the cow dies of natural causes or whatever, and now we have a dead cow in the field, how long will it take for that cow to turn into a fossil? How many years? So if you have a dead cow in the field, which ultimately decomposes, and then finally you have cow bones in the field, how many years, if you came back 500 years or 1,000 years and nothing were to disturb that, but you have that dead cow in the field, how long would it take before that dead cow became a fossil? Never. The dead cow will never become a fossil because it will be stripped away. It will ultimately degenerate, decompose, whatever. It will go back to dust. That cow will never become a fossil. The only way for it to become a fossil is if it is buried by a quick flood of silt, and so you have foot after foot after foot of dirt that comes in on top of that and preserves it, and that becomes a fossil. Otherwise, at one point there were so many buffalo in the West that literally you could look out and you could see a buffalo herd that was like a mile wide. There were that many of them. Buffalo literally covered the West. How many buffalo fossils are there now? None. None. The fossil record is in effect saying the record of the flood. And every time scientists mention the fossil record, they're really saying, although they won't admit it, the flood record. And so he's saying here that I'm going to kill everything, and also, although this didn't say it, I mean, just because we know how water works and flood work, I'm going to bury everything. He said, destroy all flesh, which has the breath of life. Everything on the earth shall perish. Verse 18. But I will establish my covenant with you, and you shall enter the ark, you and your sons, and your wife, and your sons' wives with them. And of every living thing of all flesh you shall bring. Now, interestingly enough, this was the first time God had mentioned animals. And I always see this as God's sense of humor, because God says, build the ark. I'm going to save you. I'm going to save your family. You're going to have this ark. And when I send this flood, it will not touch you. By the way, Noah, I got to add one more thing. You're going to have to fill this thing with animals. This is the first mention of the animals. God knew about the flood. He knew about the death. He knew about the ark. He knew about the dimensions of the ark before he ever found out that you got to take animals with you. Noah. And of verse 19, and of every living thing and of all flesh, you shall bring 2 of every kind into the ark to keep them alive with you. And they shall be male and female. Of the birds after their kind, and the animals after their kind, and every creeping thing of the ground after its kind, 2 of every kind will come to you to keep them alive. A lot of people say, how did Noah ever get all those animals? He didn't. He didn't have to. God said they will come to you. And there was decades for that to happen, but he said, they will come to you. One of the things that people frequently ask is like, what about What about the huge animals like the dinosaurs, like a seismosaurus or something like that? God did not say, be sure and take adults of everything. In fact, he probably took, even with dinosaurs, the average, if you take all the dinosaurs from smallest dinosaurs to largest, the average dinosaur size is about the size of a big dog. That's the average. And so, and he wouldn't, and you know, like in T-Rexes, there's like 20 different kinds of T-Rexes. Wouldn't have had to take them all. Just take 2 of them. And he could have taken babies as small as possible. And so they came to Noah, and as we look at the space that he had in the ark, there's actually enough space, as I said, 1.5 million cubic feet, or enough like 800 boxcars. We don't know exactly, you know, God has not told us a lot about how he did this. I suspect that God may have put those animals into hibernation. Maybe he did, maybe he didn't, I'm not sure. I know that just cleaning up after them would have been just a monumental thing. So I suspect that God did something to preserve during the year they were on the ark, that God did something to make it easier for Noah to manage, but we don't know that. We're not told that at any place. So he said, they will come to you, and he said, verse 21, as for you, take for yourself some of all food which is edible. Remember that mankind at this point is still vegetarian. That only after Noah's out of the ark does the idea about eating meat come about. Adam and Eve were vegetarians. They were not killing animals at that point, except for sacrifice. And that only came after they were expelled from the garden. And so, you know, they took stuff for the animals, stuff for them, and if they were hibernating or something like that, that would have meant less that they had to take. And he said, take some of all the food which is edible and gather it to yourself, and it shall be food for you and for them. Thus Noah did, according to all that God had commanded him. So he did. I think Noah was the most obedient man in the Old Testament. Notice that at this point we see this long quotation from God. We don't see anything that Noah ever said. We don't see Noah arguing with God. We don't see Noah saying, why are you doing this? Whatever God said, Noah just did it. Faith is what God is trying to build in each one of us. God wants us to believe him. And so throughout the Bible, we see God telling us something, and then man saying, yeah, that's good, and then God removing the evidences of it so that you cannot see that it's about to happen. And, you know, like God with the when the Israelites were wandering in the wilderness, and God had cared for them. They saw the plagues in Egypt. They came to the Red Sea, and they saw God part the Red Sea. They walked through on dry ground. They had seen so many miracles, and yet God's trying to build faith in them. God wants them to believe him. And the only way that God can teach you to believe him is to take you to a place where you don't see evidence, where the circumstance does not lead to that, and say, will you believe me now? As long as you can see it, that doesn't require faith. And so, what, you know, in the Israel in the wilderness, they kept saying, God, you brought us here to kill us. You brought us here to kill us. They did the same thing with the water. He took them through the Red Sea. And you would think, if you had seen God part the Red Sea, and you walked through on dry ground, and then you saw the Egyptian army come in, and you saw that water come back and drown them. If you had seen a miracle like that, that you would never have occasion to doubt God again. So he brought them to a place where there was no water. And then they said, have you brought us here to kill us? And God wanted them to say, we have no water, but we trust you. You are God, our deliverer. You brought us out of Egypt. We don't know what you're going to do, but we believe you're going to take care of us. So God gave them all these opportunities just to trust him all the way through. And finally, because they refused to trust him, he said, okay, the whole generation must die off in the wilderness. I will take the next generation in. I will try to teach them to trust me. Noah is a different figure completely. God tells him things that are so fantastic and remarkable, to build. Now, did Noah build the ark? Well, not necessarily. One person and his family, 450 foot. I mean, they had a long time to do it. But again, Noah could have been a man of means. He could have hired a lot of this out. Somebody, again, even if you don't believe in the ark, like the Ark Encounter up in Kentucky, which is this replica of the ark up there that was built by local construction people. How many of those local construction people believed in the God of the ark? Maybe very few of them. Why would you build an ark if you didn't even believe there was an ark at some point? Why would you build a replica of something you didn't believe existed? Because you're getting a paycheck. And God could have, and Noah could have paid them for that. So somebody built the ark. Noah perhaps supervised, probably worked on it, his sons, but I would think that there would have to be other people also who would have had to work on the ark during that time. But again, there were so many situations there where Noah was asked to do something he didn't understand. And God said, here's what I want you to do. And then only later explained it. And you'd never see Noah arguing with God. You never even see Noah asking God a question. It's like, whatever you want, I'll do it. And he did that over decades and decades. Okay, so let's look at the next chapter. Is chapter 7. Then Yahweh said to Noah, enter the ark, you and all your household, for you alone I have seen to be righteous before me in this time. Again, notice this is another quotation from God here. This is God speaking. Begin here in verse 1, goes down through verse 4. This is God's speech here. And he says, for you alone I have seen to be righteous before me in this time. You shall take with you of every clean animal by sevens, a male and his female, and of the animals that are not clean, 2, a male and his female. Of the birds of the sky by sevens, male and female, to keep offspring alive on the face of the earth. For after 7 more days I will send rain on the earth, 40 days and 40 nights, and I will blot out from the face of the land every living thing that I have made. Notice that at first he says, take 2 animals, but now he's more specific, and he says, if it's a clean animal, then take 7 pairs of them. If it's not a clean animal, take 2. The reason is that you see on the end when the flood is over and Noah leaves, he sacrifices. So there's a great sacrifice to God who has brought them through. And if he had just brought 2 of every animal and then he did that sacrifice, he would have exterminated whole species. And so, again, of the unclean animals that would not be sacrificed, you take 2 of those. But of the clean animals, because they're a part of the sacrificial system. Interestingly enough, just for whatever it's worth, the the instruction about clean and unclean animals came as part of the Mosaic law later on. We don't know where this came from. At this point, it's just there must have been some instruction from God about what was clean and unclean. If you go back in Genesis, at no point has God already said there are clean and unclean animals, etc. But that must have been a part of the instruction at some point. And so, but we don't know what that is. Later on, that's codified in the law of Moses. Verse 5, Noah did according to all that Yahweh had commanded him. What a beautiful epitaph, for somebody. Wouldn't you like that to be written on your tombstone? Noah did according to all that Yahweh had commanded him. Now Noah was 600 years old when the flood of water came upon the earth. Then Noah and his sons and his wife and his son's wife with him entered the ark because of the water of the flood. Of clean animals and animals that are not clean, and birds and everything that creeps on the ground, there went into the ark to Noah by twos, male and female, as God had commanded Noah. It came about that after 7 days that the water of the flood came upon the earth. In the 600th year of Noah's life, in the 7th month, in the 2nd month, on the 17th day of the month, on the same day, the fountains of the great deep burst open, and the floodgates of the sky were opened. The rain fell upon the earth for 40 days and 40 nights. Right now, if all the rain that is in the atmosphere were to be precipitated out in rain, then the earth would be covered with about an inch of water. If everything up there were to fall down and throughout the whole earth, maybe an inch. This was a flood of biblical proportions, as they say, because God did several things. Remember when the first thing God did back in creation, in chapter 1 of Genesis, the first thing God did was He said He separated the waters which were above, waters which were below. God gathered together the waters. When God began, He just made the earth as a watery, and then later He separated those waters out, and part of the waters went above, and some of us believe that there was a canopy of water, because when I don't know that Noah said it was going to rain, because I don't believe there had ever been rain before, because God said that in Genesis that He watered, that there was a mist that came up from the earth that watered the earth. I believe there was a canopy of water, vapor that covered the earth, that shielded out certain kinds of rays, could have been responsible for the longevity of humankind at that point, would have given us a different kind of atmosphere, would have given us a different kind of weather. Indeed, there would have been no weather because of that vapor canopy at that point. And also, this could be a part of the reason for the extinction of the dinosaurs. As they look today at the dinosaurs and how their respiratory system is put together, they say it would be hard for those animals to live in today's world. And it could be that they were uniquely suited for that pre-flood world, but not for the post-flood. Remember that right now, if you go to Antarctica, there is you will find go down far enough, and there's evidence of vegetation in lush vegetation in Antarctica. Why was Antarctica a garden? Because the climate of the entire earth was different, I believe, in those days. And so what happened in the flood? Two things happened in the flood. Number one, this vapor canopy, all this water that was above, collapsed onto the earth. It's, and then the water that was below, there was water that was actually underneath the surface of the earth. And it came forth, and it was like a volcano of water. So you have water from above, water from below, and you say, where do you get that? Look at verse 11. In the 600th year, in the second month, 17th day, in the same day, all the fountains of the great deep burst open, and the floodgates of the sky were opened. And so we have water coming from above, water coming from below. We have probably seismic activity, volcanoes that are erupting. It was quite a world during that time. This is not just a normal flood. This is a worldwide cataclysm. Verse 13, on the same day that Noah and Shem and Ham and Japheth, the sons of Noah, and Noah's wife, and 3 wives of the sons with them, entered the ark, they and every beast after its kind, and the cattle after their kind, and every creeping thing that creeps on the earth after its kind, and every bird after its kind, all kinds of birds. So they went into the ark to Noah, by twos of all flesh, in which was the breath of life. Those that entered, male and female of all flesh, entered as God had commanded him. And Yahweh closed it behind him. And when they were all in, Yahweh closed the door. One way in, and that way was closed. Noah had preached for maybe as much as 120 years, but certainly for decades he had preached. Hebrews calls him a preacher of righteousness. So Noah had preached, and in all that time, not one person had repented. Not one person had said, I want to be a follower of this Yahweh. And so now God closes the door. And during this period of time, it's our job to share this gospel. And how many people will come to Christ, we have no idea. But at some point, when the last person that has been chosen for salvation comes to Christ, then the end will come. Then he will initiate that series of events that will lead to his coming again. Verse 17. Then the flood came upon the earth for 40 days, and the water increased and lifted up the ark so that it rose above the earth. And the water prevailed and increased greatly on the earth, and the ark floated on the surface of the water. The water prevailed more and more upon the earth, so that all the high mountains everywhere under the heavens were covered. And again, for people who do not believe in a universal flood, they don't believe the Bible. I mean, this is very clear. What does this mean? It means exactly what it says. All the high mountains everywhere. Notice the two words. All everywhere. All of the high mountains everywhere. Not in Noah's region, but everywhere on earth. Everywhere under the heavens were covered. The water prevailed 15 cubits higher, and the mountains were covered. All flesh that moved on the earth perished, birds and cattle and beasts and every swarming thing that swarms upon the earth, and all mankind. Of all that, notice the number of the times it says all the mountains, all the animals, all mankind. How many people were killed in the flood? All of them. How much of the earth was flooded? All of it. All of it. The last part of verse 21 says, and all mankind. No survivors. Of all that was on the dry land, all in whose nostrils was the breath, and spirit of life died. Thus he blotted out every living thing that was upon the face of the land, from man to animals to creeping things and to birds of the sky, and they were blotted out from the earth, and only Noah was left, together with those that were with him in the ark. The water prevailed upon the earth 150 days. Maybe we can understand this today in terms of you're at your computer and everything gets hung up and you try to fix it and you hit escape and you do everything you can, Control Alt Delete, do everything you can. Finally, the only thing you can do to fix it is just to reboot it. And that's exactly what God did with the earth. He rebooted it. He took it back to creation state. He got rid of all the animals except for those that were in the ark and all the humans. God rebooted the earth, and he started again with this one righteous man. And so every one of us here, everyone online today, we're all brothers and sisters. We all descended from Adam and Eve, but we also all descended from Noah. So we're all distant cousins in there someplace. All races, all language groups, all people throughout the earth. We're all descendants of this one family. This is a crucially important passage. And as you read through somewhat in the Old Testament, but especially in the New Testament, you'll see the importance, not only for understanding creation, because this is a recreation. God created the world in Genesis 1. He recreated the world after Genesis 6. And so many things that people ask creationists about. You know, what about dinosaurs? You know, what about the fossil record? What about the millions of years? You know, so many things that we're asked about in terms of the veracity of the Bible that we really don't have answers for Genesis 1. If you look at Genesis 6, we see the answers for so many of those things, because the flood provides that perspective, I think, that we need. Let's pray and thank God for what he's doing. Lord, thank you so much for showing us what you did, for showing us that you are a God of faithfulness, a God of love, but also a God of judgment. Thank you that you have showed us that before you come again in judgment, that you will take your church out, so that just like Noah and his family did not have to experience the flood directly, so we will not have to experience the tribulation, the judgment that will come upon this earth. Thank you for your goodness. Thank you for your truth. Thank you that everything that you've told us, we can trust and believe. In Jesus' name, amen.